We still haven't got that opening titles music sorted, Pele. I
Oh,
think
right.
the sort of roll of drums or fanfare of trumpets, something kind of suitably theatrical or poetical to start Pele's poetry podcast with Pele Cox and me, Rich Uridge. How's your week been?
It's been fine. I've been traveling through weathers from feeling like we were having buckets of water thrown over our heads as we climbed up the stairs into the plane at Manchester Airport to coming off into warm, balmy, slightly clammy Roman sunshine.
And is Rome dripping with poetry? I mean, it's dripping with architecture, of course, and history and all sorts of allusions to grandeur. But I just wonder whether you feel the poetry more in Rome than you do in rainy Manchester, or whether there is poetry of a different sort in both places.
Actually, that's a really good question. Rome's quite reserved in terms of its literary outpourings or self-expression. I think is so dominated by its history. It's hard to hear the contemporary voice of poetry. Whereas, when when it feels like the heavens have literally opened on you in the greyest, wettest way they possibly can back in Manchester, you feel more connected to your poetic voice for some reason.
And maybe one's poetic voice is informed by all sorts of things, including the weather.
Absolutely. When I lived in Los Angeles, which I did at two periods of my life for some strange reason, the sun shone every day. If there was a drop of breeze, it would be an extraordinary occurrence, and that flattens you out. I mean, I remember saying to someone living in LA was like being drowned in a shallow puddle. It's not good for a poet.
No. Well, not a bad start to a poem, though, being drowned in a shallow puddle. Um, Look, if poetry is in part a reflection of the physical environment in which we find ourselves, the geographical location in which we find ourselves, it kind of gets me thinking about the kind of wider purpose of poetry. And as regular listeners to this podcast may know, my background is as a journalist. So to me, the purpose of journalism is super clear. It's to inform people about events, full stop. But I get hopelessly lost when I try to think, Pele, about the purpose of poetry. So I wonder if, as my guide, as my teacher, as my tutor, you could just kind of give me some help about what the purpose of poetry is.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the subject of our conversation today, isn't it? And it's a conversation that we could we could stretch over six sessions because it's as with all things poetry, the minute you think about one element that poetry is like a sort of it's something an animal that lives in the wardrobe. It's there. You can feel it breathing, having its dinner. Every now and then you go and you open to check that what the animal's like and how it's living and how it's expressing itself. So today we're going to talk about how poetry is a form of self-expression that sort of transcends all other forms of self-expression. And we're going to use three poets as an example, or three ways of expressing oneself we've noticed in poetry. Because I was listening to the Moral Maze last night on Radio 4, which you can get over here in Rome, and they were talking about imagery and the violence in imagery, Charlie Kirk's murder. And should this be allowed? Should children be being allowed to see someone actually being assassinated? And the power of the image, we need to see what's going on, basically, is the argument. And I thought about poetry as a substitute for an image, a violent image. How far can poetry go to cover the brutality of our human lives, that dimension? And I think it can go pretty far. I think it can really hit that image without that stark sort of pornographic kickback. So, and that comes through in practice. the way we absorb the poem that we're wanting to write or the experience that we feel we need to turn into something good. And also the boundary, like when you write with violent imagery or with power of words till you almost shock yourself, how far do you want to take that as a poet? And that's where you hit the chemistry of it. That's my first thought.
And that poem that emerges is, if you like, an acceptable proxy for the reality, which, as you suggest, might be too explicit, almost pornographic in its explicit nature, and therefore renders the experience acceptable to a wider audience, including children, but also helps us understand the nature of that violent incident, whether it's the murder of Charlie Kirk or whether it's war or famine or whatever it happens to be that is the subject of that poem. So it takes reality and it shape shifts it like that beast in the wardrobe that you were talking about a moment ago, without losing the essence of the event. So it's not censored, it's changed.
Exactly. But there's also there's so when I was at UEA, I remember one of my colleagues, fellow poetry students, brought along a poem about I can't remember the artist, but there was an exhibition on at Tate Britain about I don't know what it was, contemporary art. Anyway, someone had drawn a portrait of Myra Hindley with their hands. I don't know if anyone remembers, and it was a very controversial thing to have any kind of image of Myra Hindley allowed in a museum space. And my colleague, very good poet, had written a poem about this piece of work. And I remember Andrew Motion got really cross and said, "You mustn't write about these kinds of things because you're glorifying them." And that sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but I do now understand the difference. It's like I am the filter, I am the censor. I almost have to make it about my experience to allow it to be, because if I just write out something for my own shocking gain, the poem is lost. I hope that makes sense.
And that point that you make about writing from your own experience, your reaction to that photograph, the example you've given, that's important. You've got to put yourself, have you, as poet, and your emotional response to something at the front and center of that poem.
Yeah, I mean, I would never write about an image I would never write about Charlie Kirk because it's nothing to do with me. I don't have any experience of it. I mean, I could write about it as a starting point for sure. So, for example, someone on Moral Maze was mentioning how his microphone was covered in blood, right? Super symbolic image. So I could write that as a first line and then step outside and talk about my walk towards the Colosseum, which is five minutes down the road. That's how I tackle that issue. Probably not mention Charlie Kirk again.
And it's your own experience that is the well from which you draw poetry. That has to be the case. Otherwise, what?
Well, when I was a poet in residence at the Royal Academy, when I was appointed, I didn't want to go in there and write about the paintings on the walls, right? Because first of all, I think that's boring for everyone. Everyone has their own understanding of those paintings, the Rothkos or the crack in the floor, which was there when I was poet in residence at the Tate. I did actually write a poem about that, but it wasn't very successful. And I think the work has already been done. The painting has already been painted. There's lots of people that advocate this. The sculpture's already been crafted and cast. Why you don't need a poem at that point as well. So, the poem is about it's the creation fire inside the poet wanting to write something from inside, not about something on the outside.
So we talk about two poets who clearly had a fire inside them. Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, writing from their experience always. Sylvia's experience of her madness, I'll put it that bluntly. Ted writing from his experience as her partner, as her widower, and in later years, writing the birthday letters as a way of continuing to communicate with her post-mortem. Is that what you mean by writing from your own experience? Are they exemplary when it comes to drawing on one's own experience to find something useful to say that might be popular beyond a narrow audience?
Yeah, so there's a lovely article which I've just been reading, because we're going to talk about birthday letters, aren't we? By Robert McCrum, in which he cites the Ted Hughes' birthday letters, his poems about his dead wife, as one of the great non-fiction works of our time. And he talks about a wild collective consciousness that these poems tap into. And I think when you really reach the heights of being a poet, you're writing from the depths. The poem can touch every corner of the world outside and the inside of the world inside the reader. And it is a cosmic thing. So you're reaching for that. Just because you're writing from inside, it doesn't mean that your poem isn't going to touch the outside world in new ways.
And do you think when Ted sat at his desk, he was writing with that in mind, or was that the end point, that he didn't look at that end point? It was happenstance.
This is very interesting. So Ted Hughes began writing. I mean, you may all know that he suffered an extraordinary backlash from Sylvia Plath's suicide. People were even chipping Sylvia Plath Hughes, chipping his name off her gravestone after he died, and calling him a murderer. Now, there's a big backstory to that, which is fascinating. But obviously, some people said he was buried alive with her. And obviously, to recover from that, as the great poet, the great craftsman that he was going to write about it. But he never wrote about Sylvia Plath when they were together. And he never wrote in a visible sense. And he never wrote about her after she died, until he started writing poetic letters to her, just as a way to reach out to her and express some kind of feeling of union and communication and connection. And I think that's another really important thing about poetry. You know, sometimes the poet is writing to something that they love, that they cannot reach or they cannot hear. And this idea of a poem as a letter, is really symbolic. I mean, every poem in a way is a letter to something, isn't it? And he realized that after he started writing the letters, he started having these very vivid dreams about their marriage. And another important thing to think about is that poetry does unleash and release energy and memory, feeling from the past. And from this, he decided that he'd have to return to the poetic form. And this is where the birthday letters were born. And he wrote one every year on her birthday. I think partly because it was too powerful. The energy of writing about this tragedy every day would have been too much. So he didn't tell anybody about it. And then just before he died, he announced that he was going to publish these 88 poems on the story of their love and their mythical story.
I've chosen one called 55, Eltisley. The reason I've chosen this one is that I think it really exemplifies the point, illustrates the point that you were making about how a poem can be both intensely personal, but also have a resonance that is universal. And that's what marks it out for greatness. He's writing from his experience, but he is touching on an experience that many of us have had. 55, Eltisley. Our first home has forgotten us, I saw when I drove past it, how slight our lives had been to have left not a trace. When we first moved in there, I looked for omens. Vacated by a widow gathered to her family, all it told me was her life is over. She had left the last blood of her husband staining a pillow. Their whole story hung a miasma round that stain. Senility's sour odour. It had condensed like a grease on the cutlery. It confirmed your idea of England, part nursing home, part morgue, for something partly dying, partly dead. Just so the grease-grimed shelves, the tacky dark walls of the hutch of a kitchen revolted you into a fury of scouring. I studied the blood. Was it mouth blood or ear blood or the blood of a head wound after some fall? I took possession before anything of ours had reconditioned that crypt of old griefs and its stale gas of a dead husband. I claimed our first home alone and slept in it alone. So it goes on for another half a page. But
Wow.
exactly, wow. I
So,
mean,
yeah, go on, Richard.
every day, an experience of somebody moving into an old house rather than a new house, of course, that has a history, a back history, in this case, a mysterious and bloody back history, but also prefigures the future. And it works at so many levels, but it just makes that point really clearly that whilst he's writing about himself, and he's writing, of course, yes, in this letter to Sylvia about Sylvia and their first time together, he's also writing something that is universal and would be understood by a huge audience.
So yeah, Rich, when you're writing, so I know that we used these poems as a go-to for some of your more difficult work. When your experience hit tragedy, could you talk a little bit about why you found these poems, these great poems, useful in terms of how you approached your subject matter?
Yeah, I suppose we should just wind back a little bit to the subject matter. And the short version is that my elderly mother, who was living with dementia in a care home, was brutally attacked by another resident, suffered catastrophic head and bodily injuries, and died within a few hours in hospital. So a bloody end at the end of her long and well-lived life. We knew she was going to die. We clearly didn't know the manner of her parting, which was very dramatic indeed. And that happened in the early years of our working together. You helping me guide my nascent poetry. And I remember saying to you before this all happened, what is a middle class, late middle aged bloke who's had a comfortable really got to say about the world? I mean, who's ever going to read my stuff? It's nonsense. It's not valuable at all. And be careful what you wish for, Rich. Then this happened and gave me a whole heap of things to write about. And I don't mean that in a kind of nasty, exploitative way. It just really does focus your mind on purpose of poetry, and I guess help me think through what had happened.
The poetry prepared you, didn't it? The fact you were working as a poet was good preparation for the tragedy ahead. I would say it was what the equation is. Am I right?
That's a really good summary. Yeah, I think both the sort of the longer time that I've been working as a journalist was preparation, and then the much shorter time, but very intense time that we'd spent together working on poetry was equally helpful. So the two things together helped me make sense of what a sense is senseless, if that makes sense. Too many senses in there, that I could approach it journalistically and look at it in a slightly detached and dispassionate way, although I was a sort of significant player in that particular story. Or a character in that story, but poetry went further and helped in a different way. And one of the ways it helped is thinking through. And you alerted me to the birthday letters and to Sylvia Plath's poetry, as well as not just the birthday letters, but Ted Hughes' other poetry. And what it helps you do is to make sense of something that, as I say, is another word. Here it comes again. Make sense of something that you would struggle to make sense of without poetry as a kind of language. Does that make sense to you? Because saying it out loud, it sounds really, I'll be blunt, it sounds a bit naff. But struggling to make sense of something in a conventional way without poetry would seem to me almost impossible to do.
Yeah, and you have to lay down certain other nodes of expression, don't you, around this idea. So one of them might be photography. Not that it would work in that case, but the urge to see the old, the outside of the old people's home or the bed in which she died comes to mind. Also journalism, which of course you are one yourself. You want to read a blow by blow account of the events, time, the technical nature of the slaughter in a way. And then we come to poetry, which, is such a gracious guest in this house of the expressive, the need to express pain. And I remember saying to you, Rich, it's all about process when you write poetry and about practice. You need to write whenever you can about what you're feeling into a notebook. It doesn't matter if what you write isn't a poem. It doesn't matter if what you write sounds a bit over the top or overwhelming, or even if it's nonsensical. Just get it all down because you're writing out the anatomical form of the pain, and you have to let it lead in a way and be a vessel for it. Now, just to go back to the birthday letters, the reason that the birthday letters were so useful to us, wasn't it, was that the way that Hughes manages to unspool the pain and the narrative together. So you're reading stories that sometimes are unrelated, but always go back to this point of this terrible event that's going to happen in his life that we all know about. And that's the other thing, he understood the event was the lodestar, wasn't it? So everyone knows about this terrible thing. So in a way, he can write freely about other things, and it's still associated in our minds as we read those lines about a house that he walks into the door of. We know that ends in his wife's suicide. Every single line, she sits there between. So did you use those elements, and how far did you use those elements in like your wonderful poem, for example, Yellow Underpants?
Yeah, it found its way. The birthday letters, Ted Hughes, he, Sylvia, she, they found their way into a lot of the stuff that was written around about that time, where it is descriptive and plain and matter of fact on the one hand, but contains within it something much more profound at another level. I like your way of, Sylvia being between every single line of the birthday letters. And I think what happened to my mother is in between every single line of
Yeah.
the care home car park, which I've got in front of me right now. I don't know.
Little poem. Can I just ask before you read it, how much, when you were writing these amazing, wonderful cries to the tragedy gods, did you feel you were trying to shock? And how much did it just come out as it actually was and then shocked us in that natural sense? Were you trying to shock with the language, or was the language just coming out of you and made shock happen itself?
I was never, knowingly, at least consciously, trying to shock. Far from it. Nothing was going to quite measure up to the initial shock in any case. No words could do that justice. So, just trying not to shock. I let the words come out. The poems wrote themselves. But
like your John Clare statement of last time.
He saw the fields and wrote them down. I'm getting the quote slightly wrong there, but absolutely, they had written themselves before the mechanical bit, of the words coming out of the end of my fingers onto the screen or onto the notebook. And they were written at the time, as a police officer might say, giving court evidence in court. May I refer to my contemporaneous pocket notebook when the matters were fresh in my mind. This wasn't a mental note taken or a written note taken that I returned to months, weeks, or even years later. This happened a couple of years ago. Um, this was written at the time, and it was written almost as one. It was polished, of course, but it's big Tears in a Care Home Car Park, and that's the title.
Tears. Would you read it for us, because it's so resonant?
Tears in a Care Home Car Park. A facade, clay bricks, light brown, plain, wire cut, institutional. The mortar holding them together while inside everything is falling apart. A sarcophagus for the double dead, calcium, bone white, brittle, ready to snap. And on the sticky black tarmac below, parked cars, caught like flies in a trap. A door opens, and out pours a flood of tears, a wreck pulled from the deep, the drowned man asleep at the wheel.
Fantastic. And what to me, what's amazing about a poem is that it doesn't have to be a rational being. It can pull on the past and the dark and unrelated objects and throw them into the mix. Perhaps because it's already been formed before we put it down, and some strange, crazy magic is being written all around us all the time, and the poets are just the vessels, and the writers, they're the accountants. Anyway.
Crazy words all flying around, and sometimes the poetry gods, so this is going to sound like nonsense, but they align, don't they, these crazy words that are flying around, and then they find somebody who can be the lightning conductor, the rod for those words, and before you even know it, they've found their way onto a screen or onto a piece of paper, and then you read them back and you think, oh, did I write that? Yeah. And looking back at that, I read it periodically. I've read it publicly a couple of times. Every time I read it, I think the same thing. Did I actually write that?
I can testify that you did.
It is, yeah.
What lines really come out? What lines do you feel you wrote least, and what lines do you feel you wrote most? I know you wrote them all, but what's startling about that to you, the poet?
What's startling is I'm there every single time. It's a double floored building. My mother's care home at Ridgeway Lodge in Dunstable, on the Luton and Dunstable border. It is that, clay brick, institutional looking building with an upstairs and a downstairs. I park my car out the front, and I can see my mother's room, on the right hand side, and it transports me there. It takes me through time and space. It is, I don't know, it's like a little time machine or a little zoom across time and space. I like the first line.
Read it to us again.
2 words, a facade. There is a duality about that, isn't there? A facade, the facade of a building that hides something behind it. When you see the facade of a building, you're in Rome, and there are lots of beautiful.
Yes.
And of course, behind those facades lie all sorts of things that aren't quite as grand as the facade, potentially. Maybe inside a building, even grander, who knows? But there is a mystery when you look at a facade. There is something lying behind that. And of course, deliberate, I guess, but it didn't feel deliberate at the time. There is also the facade of one's own behavior in response to, the House of Horrors, that you describe it as. And so the very first line of 2 words kind of leads you into a building, an unknown building, that isn't just full of horrors, but is full of other stuff as well. Lots of old people with backstories who may be towards the end of their lives, but it's like a portal. I've talked about poems, this poem in particular, taking me back through time. So it's a kind of H.G. Wellian time machine at one level. But poetry also strikes me as a kind of door, a portal through which you pass to another world. And my non-poetic friends think that this is kind of crazy, and they've never been through that portal to the other side, and they kind of really don't get it, and they think I'm bonkers, and they may be right. But I think there is another side through that portal, and Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath and other great poets. I could list hundreds or thousands of great poets who enable you to unlock that portal and to travel through it yourself, either as a reader or as a writer of poetry.
I mean, it's exactly right. Portal is such a great word because, who doesn't subscribe to The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, and C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Those are like the basics, like the simple forms of what you're talking about, aren't they? The wardrobe through into this magical world, and these magical lands, which are very similar to where we live near Wales, aren't they? Because I actually went there to Wales the other day, near to where Tolkien rented a house and wrote a lot of Lord of the Rings, and it is. I was going to ask you what the tools are that you need to be armed with to be able to move through this portal into poetry. And I know one of the ones you'll say is landscape, but please tell me the other ones that you feel. What was in your toolkit, your Tolkien toolkit, while you were writing these poems?
Complete honesty. We are all of us dishonest, aren't we, with our own thoughts and feelings?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, a facet of ourselves that we think is the most beautifully cut part of the jewel or rough stone. Um, and I don't think you can write a good poem, and I've written many, many bad ones because I haven't subscribed to my own rule of being brutally honest. But I think the best poets and the best poems are approached by the writer from a position of complete and utter honesty, of nakedness. Can I say that? Even nakedness.
Completely. And exposure. So how do you reach that point of honesty? Is it in this case, because you've written many poems on many subjects, in this case, was it because it was like the burn was so extreme that there wasn't anything but honesty left, or was it that you just had to pay homage to this moment that made you honest? What was it that gave, because it's difficult. Andrew Motion used to say, Pele, you need to write in your own voice.
Mm.
And it's taken me a lifetime to write in my own voice. And I think there's similar things. So
Yeah.
what was it in this? Because that car park poem it's brutal. It's simple, honest, searing melancholy, isn't it?
Yeah, I was laughing then knowingly because I was going to continue your metaphor of this sort of sense of burning that you get and to say, that brutal honesty is akin to nakedness. And I was going to say, and I will say it in any case, because I think it does fit in with what we're talking about, how it almost feels as if your clothes are on fire and throw them off because they are burning. Well,
Mm.
burning inside, and the only way is to throw off your clothes and sit there naked, not in the literal sense, although of course laying awake at night. And I have written poems in that straight state of undress. Something about a poem that wants to be written, that perhaps has already been written and needs you to write it, that is akin to saying, oh, do you know what? Fuck it. Can I say that? I've just said it. There we are. I've got to throw my clothes off and write this right now. And if you keep your clothes on, if you aren't prepared to show everybody everything, and I don't mean that in a
If
literal,
you put a comfort blanket around yourself.
and I think I've been very of keeping all my clothes on or throwing a comfort blanket around myself and not getting to that state where
Mm.
I am shivering and naked and cold.
You're
Some,
not reaching for any protection except truth itself.
and that is the protection and the poem perhaps subsequently can provide some kind of cover or whatever.
I mean, I think it's very easy to start talking in a way that might make somebody listening think this is all just so opulent and obscure and elite, not elitist, because I don't think that's true at all. But this stuff that we're relaying is born only of, reading poetry by other people, being out in the world and practicing writing things down with a pen and paper over a period of time. And, I don't know if I said this in the last one, maybe it's going to be my mantra, but, I am writing poetry all the time, even when I walk down the street to go and buy a pint of milk. I am writing, and it's the last 5% that gets down on the paper. And I think, to demystify this idea of being a poet is the most important thing about these podcasts.
I think we should end where we kind of started, and that is with Ted Hughes, because I'm always keeping one eye on the clock. And we've been talking for nearly 40 minutes.
Goodness me.
If you've got it in front of you, the whole piece, the letter from Ted to Sylvia, is called The Blue Flannel Suit.
Here we are in the spirit of poetry's power to shock. That blue suit, a mad execution uniform, survived your sentence. But then I sat, stilled, unable to fathom what stilled you as I looked at you, as I am stilled, permanently now, permanently, bending so briefly at your open coffin.